As a 15-year-old kid, I could not get out of the house enough. On the summer days, in the autumn, and even during the cold, fresh days of winter, to grab a rucksack, pull it on my shoulders, and head off out into the Nottinghamshire countryside to walk, to camp, to visit friends who might live 10 or 15, or on one occasion even 60 miles away one weekend. That's how far I walked to go and visit a friend for a few days, to enjoy myself out in the countryside that I love so much. In those days, there was still a lot of second-hand books at jumble sales, in second-hand shops and in vintage bookshops, which dealt with literally the art or the lifestyle of tramping, of living on the open roads between the green hedgerows and living on fruit, doing casual labour and picking up odd jobs wherever you could. But those were stories of people who had grown up and lived in the end of the 19th century and had enjoyed the early years of the 20th century and the freedom that came from the open road. The attraction of the open road, the green road, the ancient way, has always been a massive attraction. I came to it at the end of the 20th century as a teenage boy and loved it. One of the books that was a huge inspiration to me was this one, The Autobiography of a Super-tramp by W.H. Davies, William Henry Davies. This book, for me, fed and continued that narrative of tramping stories and encounters on the open road. And it very much informed how I spent much of my adolescent years and until I was in my 20s and at university. In the preface, which was written by George Bernard Shaw, there is significant reference to the work of William Henry Davies as a poet, and I didn't really make that connection at the age I had when I read the book, but I do remember from school days one of his poems, which is called Leisure, and it begins with the following lines, which I'm sure you'll remember. What is this life if, full of care, we have no time to stand and stare? And think about that from the perspective of somebody who is out in the countryside, who is enjoying a rural life, a rural existence. Those lines belong to W.H. Davies, another poet also with a Welsh background. Davies was born in Wales, but he formed a friendship in the early 1900s with Edward Thomas, who is also well renowned for his love of the English countryside and for his walking along various footpaths across the country, in particular the Icknield Way and the route that takes diagonally across Britain from the North Sea down to Wessex. As a 15 and 16-year-old boy, I didn't make the connection at the time with those two particular writers because W.H. Davies was somebody who I was attracted to, not because of his poetry, I didn't know his poetry, but because of the book. Edward Thomas is somebody I came to learn about much later in life, but I still have a love of his stories, and his connection with and his mentorship almost by Robert Frost greatly influenced me in some of the ways that I think about the countryside. William Henry Davies was an older man than Edward Thomas, but he enjoyed a friendship with Thomas and his wife Helen, and they had a lot of correspondence, much of which still exists in museums today. I'd like to read to you from this book and share some of the things that I have read countless times over the years, bearing in mind that I've owned this book for more than 40 years, because it takes me straight away back into my childhood. But this is a book that's informed lots of the adventures that I've had in my life, and I'd like to share some of those with you by reading extracts from the book, including the preface by Bernard Shaw. Shaw writes in his preface, "The manuscript came into my hands under the following circumstances. In the year 1905, I received by post a volume of poems by one William H. Davies, whose address was The Farmhouse, Kennington, SE, as in South East London. I was surprised to learn that there was still a farmhouse left in Kennington, for I did not then suspect that the farmhouse, like the Shepherdess Walks and Nightingale Lanes and Whetstone Parks of Bethnal Green and Holborn, is so called nowadays in irony, and is in fact a doss house, or hostelry where single men can have a night's lodging for at most sixpence. I was not surprised at getting the poems. I get a gift of minor poetry once a week or so, and yet, hardened as I am to it, I still, knowing how much these little books mean to their authors, can seldom throw them aside without a twinge of compunction, which I allay by a glance at one of the pages in the faint but inextinguishable hope of finding something valuable there. Sometimes a letter accompanies the book, and then I get a rapid impression from the handwriting and notepaper, as well as from the binding and type in the book, or even from the reputation of the publisher, of the class and type of the author. Thus, I guess, Cambridge or Oxford or Maida Vale or West Kensington or Exeter or the Lakes or the East Coast, or a Newdigate prizeman, a romantic Jew, a maiden lady, a shy country parson, or whom not, what not, where not. When Mr. Davies' book came to my hand, my imagination failed me. I could not place him. There were no author's compliments, no publisher's compliments, indeed no publisher in the ordinary channel of the trade in minor poetry. The author, as far as I could guess, had walked into a printer's or a stationer's shop, handed in his manuscript, and ordered his book as he might have ordered a pair of boots. It was marked, price £0.50. An accompanying letter asked me very civilly if I required a £0.50 book of verses, and if so, would I please send the author the £0.50? If not, would I return the book? This was attractively simple and sensible. Further, the handwriting was remarkably delicate and individual, the sort of handwriting one might expect from Shelley or George Meredith. I opened the book and was more puzzled than ever, for before I had read 3 lines, I perceived that the author was a real poet. His work was not in the least strenuous or modern. There was in it no sign that he had ever read anything later than Cowper or Crabbe, nor even Byron, Shelley or Keats, much less Morris, Swinburne, Tennyson or Henley and Kipling. There was indeed no sign of his ever having read anything other than as a child reads. The result was a freedom from literary vulgarity, which was like a draught of clear water in a desert. Here I saw was a genuine innocent, writing odds and ends of verse about odds and ends of things, living quite out of the world in which such things are usually done, and knowing no better, or rather no worse, than to get his book made by the appropriate craftsman and hawk it around like any other ware. So George Bernard Shaw reads this volume of poetry and enjoys it. He's surprised by it. He loves the fact that it comes from a straightforward man who also, as he reads the poems and they engage in correspondence over a period of time, then Shaw goes to write in his preface, I presently saw in a London newspaper an enthusiastic notice of the poems and an account of an interview with the author, from which I learned that he was a tramp, that the farmhouse was a doss house, and that he was cut off from ordinary industrial pursuits by 2 circumstances. First, that he had mislaid one of his feet somewhere on his trampings, and now had to make shift as best he could with the other. Second, that he was a man of independent means, a rentier, in short, a gentleman. The exact amount of his independent income was 10 shillings a week. Finding this too much for his needs, he devoted 20% of it to pensioning necessitous friends in his native place of Wales, saved a further percentage to print verses with, and lived modestly on the remainder. My purchase of 8 copies of the book enabled him, or so I gathered, to discard all economy for about 3 months. It also moved him to offer me the privilege, for such I quite sincerely deem it, of reading his autobiography in manuscript. The following pages will enable the world at large to read it in print. And from that I learned something which I used many times growing up, that it was okay to approach somebody who you didn't know, who you might want help and support and maybe some mentorship from, but to do so politely by writing a letter, reaching out to them and asking for their guidance or their perspective on what you had for them to work through or to read through in the case of these poems. And the second thing that really leapt off the page to me as a youngster at the time was that this poet had an income of a few shillings every month and that he could live quite well on that. And that idea, to me as a 16-year-old, that you could make money from your writing and it would be enough to live on, perhaps for several months at a time, that sparked a seed of interest in me which never went away. And so that when I wrote my first book, the idea of writing it was to generate an income which would allow me to buy property that I could then rent out for more income and give me the opportunity to use that income to live on while I wrote another book. So thank you, William Henry Davies, for that spark of an idea and for the inspiration that has given to me and to countless other people, I'm sure, who read that book. When Davies is just 19 years old, his grandmother dies, and along with his siblings, he is left a small amount of money. He receives £15 and makes the decision to wisely invest a little bit of that and to use the rest to purchase a one-way ticket to America. He's heard so many great things about it. He wants to go there, to travel, to be an adventurer, to explore the lands that he's heard of in terms of stories and rumours and information coming back from other people who have travelled to and visited the United States and come back to the UK and shared their stories and their ideas. Here is his account of the first journey that he makes to the States. On arriving at Liverpool, I made the acquaintance of a man who had been in America some years previously, and not having his hopes realised at that time, had returned desperate to England, taken in a fresh cargo of hopes, and was now making a second attempt with as much enthusiasm, if not more, than others in making their first. In him I placed implicit confidence, and received such an extraordinary description of that country, the number of stories of some of its highest buildings, which were called skyscrapers, the houses of wood which could be moved from one street to another without in any way interfering with the comfort of the people within, cooking, sweeping and washing going on without hindrance, the loneliness of its prairies and deserts, engineering triumphs over high mountains. All this happening under one wide-spreading flag. This made such an impression on me that I at once went to the steerage cabin and wrote a full description of the country that very first evening aboard, telling of my arrival in America and the difference between the old and the new world. The letter was given to the steward at Queenstown and was written to save me the trouble of writing on my arrival so that I might have more time to enjoy myself. Several years elapsed before it occurred to me how foolish and thoughtless I had been. The postmark itself would prove that I had not landed in America, and they would also receive the letter several days before it would be due from those distant shores. I can certainly not boast a large amount of common sense. It was in the month of June that we made this voyage, and the great Atlantic was as smooth as an inland river. Everyone sought to escape the thoughts of home, and to do so, we often worked ourselves into a frenzy of singing and dancing. Sometimes our attention would be drawn to an iceberg on the port side, very innocent and beautiful to the eyes of passengers, but feared by mariners who saw into its depth. And then a ship sail or another great Atlantic liner on the starboard bow. There was a total lack of ceremony aboard, strangers familiar with strangers, and the sexes doing each other little kindnesses, who had never met before and probably would never meet again, parting without even inquiring or giving each other a name. As we neared the coast we had a thunderstorm, and I was surprised and somewhat awed at the sound of its peals, and at the slower and larger flashes of lightning. Nature, it seemed, used a freer and more powerful hand in this country of great things than is her wont amongst our pretty little dales and our small green hills. I thought the world was coming to an end, and in no way felt reassured when an American, noting my expression, said that it was nothing to what I would see and hear if I remained long in God's own country. My impression of America from the beginning is of the best, and I have never since had cause to alter my mind. They are a kind, sympathetic race of people, and naturally proud of their country. The Irish American is inclined to be the most bitter, remembering from his youth the complaints of his parents, who were driven through unjust laws from their own beloved land. And such a man is not to be idly aggravated. This man is not to be aggravated, especially under the consideration that our conscience is not too clean in this respect, and that we are apt to be very slow in making that open confession which is good for the soul. I was so anxious to see the different states of America that I did not stay long in New York before I succumbed to the persuasion of my Liverpool acquaintance to visit with him some friends in a small town in the state of Connecticut, at which place we soon arrived, with something like $10 between us. America at this time was suffering from a depression in trade, and people were daily returning to the old country, most of them with the intention of returning again to America at a more favourable time. Not being able to get employment at once and resolved to be independent of the bounty of strangers, I walked out alone and sat on a seat in the park, trying to conceive some plans for the future. And suddenly, becoming aware of a man occupying the other end of the seat, I inquired of him the way to Chicago, as though the distance was a paltry 10 miles instead of 100 times greater. The man looked at me in astonishment and at last asked me if I intended to beat my way there. Seeing my lack of understanding, he inquired as to my financial resources. On shaking my head in the negative, implying that I had no money, he said to me, "No more have I, and if you are agreeable, we will both beat our way to Chicago." And so Henry Davies begins a long time spent with a man who has the nickname of Brum, an Englishman who has been in America for several years before, and so they move their way, or they beat their way, as they call it, from door to door, from community to community, walking across America, from New York to Chicago. This man was Brum, a notorious beggar who made himself at home in all parts of the country, from the Atlantic to the Pacific coast, and from the northern provinces of Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. The easy and sumptuous way of his catering made me indifferent to all manual labour. In that country where food was to be had for the asking, where it often went begging to be received, and people were not likely to suffer for their generosity, I became, under Brum's tutorage, a lazy wretch with but little inclination for work. Cockneys made good beggars. They are held in high esteem by the fraternity in America. Their resource, originality and invention, and a never faltering tongue, enable them to often attain their ends where others fail, and they succeed where native Americans starve. But my friend Brum held them in great scorn, for their methods were not his methods. Brum was a genuine beggar who did not make flashes in the dark, having one day plenty and nothing on the next day. What he required he proceeded to beg, every morning making an inventory of his wants. Rather than wash a good handkerchief, he would beg an old one that was clean, and he would without hesitation discard a good shirt altogether rather than sew a button on, thus keeping up the dignity of his profession to the extreme. In every street, he said, there lived a good Samaritan. And seeing that a good beggar knocks at every door, he must ultimately succeed. She may live in the last house, and therefore the unsuccessful beggar, having no patience and perseverance, fails in his calling. Brum was a slow man in action and went about his business in a dogged way. And that reminds me of how this slowness of action once saved his life. We had built a campfire in the woods within a mile or more of a small town. So Henry Davies is 19 when he gets to the States, and he is quickly introduced to the concept of tramping and begging his way across the States by meeting with his friend Brum. I was 3 years younger than that when I was exposed to this book, and 2 years later, at the age of 18, I went to the States on a paid-for holiday, basically. I worked as what's called a camp counselor on a children's summer camp Having read this book as a teenager and devoured it page by page, I was 18 when I went to the States to work for 2 months on a summer camp. So I went as what's called a camp counselor, and my job for those 2 months was to set up a campsite in the woods on a huge country estate in the Catskill Mountains of upstate New York. It was called Camp Olympus, and it was near a little town, of course, called Liberty, New York. There were probably about 40 of us between 18 and 25 from countries all over Europe who worked together that summer to host events for the kids who were in our care. And afterwards, many of us went travelling in the States for another month or two before flying back to the UK. One of the things that I did in the States was to hitchhike from New York to San Francisco and then back across Canada to the North Atlantic coast again. But one of my routes of travel was to ride on freight trains. And I learned that from this amazing book. Here William Davies says, and he's with his friend Brum, "I was soon initiated into the mysteries of beating my way by train, which is so necessary in parts of that country, seeing the great distances between towns. Sometimes we were fortunate enough to get an empty car," and by car he means what's called a box car, which is one of the carriages towed by the engine. Sometimes we were fortunate enough to get an empty car. Sometimes we had to ride the bumpers, and often When travelling through a hostile country, we rode on the roof of a car so as not to give the brakesman an opportunity of striking us off the bumpers unawares. It is nothing unusual in some parts to find a man, always a stranger, lying dead on the track, often cut in many pieces. At the inquest, they invariably bring in a verdict of accidental death, but we know different. Therefore, we rode the car's top so as to be at no disadvantage in a struggle. The brakesman, knowing well that our fall would be his own, would not be too eager to commence hostilities. Sometimes we were desperate enough to ride the narrow iron rods which were under the car, and only a few feet from the track. This required some nerve, for it was not only uncomfortable, but the train, being so near the line, seemed to be running at a reckless and uncontrollable speed, whereas, riding on the car's top, a much faster train seems to be running much slower and far more smooth and safe. Sometimes we were forced to jump off a moving train at the point of a revolver. At other times the brakesmen were friendly and even offered assistance in the way of food, drink or tobacco. Again, when no firearm was in evidence, we sometimes had to threaten the brakesman with violence if he interfered with us. In this way, Brum and myself travelled the states of America, sleeping at night by campfires and taking temporary possession of empty houses. And that is so true. To travel by train across the states is something that thousands of people do all the time, riding on the freight trains. I remember in my trip from the East Coast over to San Francisco, I jumped on a freight train one night or one afternoon in Denver, and some of the hobos in the yard had said to me that that train would go to San Francisco, and it did. But it was freezing cold. We went through the Rocky Mountains, and I say we, there was me and other hobos that I didn't really know other than for the 36 hours that the train took slowly to move from Denver to San Francisco. But I was in shorts and a t-shirt. I had one little down puffer jacket, but that wasn't enough. I had no gloves, no hat or scarf, and I was very fearful of the cold and actually freezing, clinging to the outside of the freight car as we rose up into the mountains. But I was really fortunate because one of the engineers or the brakemen who support the driver, he spotted me and beckoned me forward. I don't know why or how he took me to be different from the other riders on the train that night, but I was able to sit in the warmth of the cabin several meters behind the driver and drink hot cocoa and eat biscuits on the way down through the mountains to San Francisco the next afternoon. So for me, it was an amazing experience, and I rode on several trains during that trip, and I'll never forget it. But I owe this man an enormous favour of introducing me even to the merest concept of riding on a freight train as a form of transport. There are so many stories that you can take from this book and really enjoy. And one last one I'd like to share is from a chapter in the middle of the book. It's called Home, and it's about him deciding to return to England, where he will later develop his time with writing and the creation of poetry. But this is how he made that decision, and this is his final journey in the States. It's chapter 17, and it's called Home. I had now been in the United States of America something like 5 years, working here and there as the inclination seized me, which I must confess was not often. I was certainly getting some enjoyment out of life, but now and then the waste of time appalled me, for I still had a conviction that I was born to a different life. The knowledge that I had the advantage over the majority of strangers in that country often consoled me when feeling depressed, for my old grandmother had left me 1/3 profit of a small estate, my share at that time amounting to 10 shillings per week, and during these 5 years I had not drawn 1 penny, therefore having over £100 entered to my account. So when one would say how much he desired to return to his native land but had no means of doing so, I would then explain how it could easily be done on the cattle boat. And if he protested, saying that he had not the courage to remain penniless after so many years abroad, although I had no answer to console him, his objection was a pleasant reminder of my own expectations. It was this knowledge that made me so idle and so indifferent to saving, and it was this small income that has been, and is in a commercial sense, the ruin of my life. It was now the end of October, and I was in Chicago squandering a summer's earnings, having during the previous months worked on a fruit farm in Illinois. I had been idling for 3 weeks, visiting the various theatres at night and reading during the day. One Sunday I had bought a weekly paper, wherein I read an appreciation of the poet Burns, with numerous quotations from his work. My thoughts wandered back to the past, the ambition of my early days, and the encouraging work of my elders. "Ah," I said with a sigh, "if during those 5 years I had had the daily companionship of good books, instead of all this restless wandering to and fro in a strange land, my mind at the present hour might be capable of some little achievement of its own." And this is the seed of an idea. This is the beginning of his potential development of poetry, as we shall see later in the book. Not in this excerpt and not in my readings, but if you read the book and you enjoy it, you'll see what happens as he returns to England. These thoughts haunted me all day, and that night a great joy came over me. For after my thoughts had tugged and pulled at my heart, all pointing in the one direction, which I saw was towards England, I settled with myself to follow them to that place. So that night I resolved to leave Chicago early the following day, beat my way to Baltimore, work a cattle boat to either Liverpool or London, and from one of these places make my way back to where I belonged. With this object, I was up early the next morning, had breakfast, and, in as happy a mood as when I first landed in America, left Chicago for the last time. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was an easy road to beat. I had taken with me a good lunch, a small flask of whiskey, so that I may attend to travelling for 20 or 30 hours without suffering thirst or hunger. At the end of 36 hours, I got off a train, now being hungry and thirsty, at a small town, having by then traversed half the distance between Chicago and Baltimore. Without staying any length of time in Pittsburgh, I caught a train for Connersville, and arriving there in a few hours, had to dismount and wait the next train for Cumberland in the state of Maryland. A train was now being made up, consisting of flat cars loaded with iron rails and coal cars also loaded. There was not much necessity on this road of concealing oneself, so I boldly mounted a coal car, and there I sat, exposed to the elements, and to the curious gaze of people at various small towns through which we passed. What surprised me not a little was that I seemed to be the only man that was beating his way on this train, whereas, this being such an easy road, most trains had a number of tramps riding them, some of them having 20 or more. It did not take me long to notice that the people at the different stations and villages stared at me with something like awe, had pale faces, pointed at me in an unusual manner, and whispered amongst themselves. Now, between Connersville and Cumberland, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad crosses the Allegheny Mountains, and often the train, when it is heavy, can crawl up the hill, after which it runs down at a terrific speed. We had just mounted a steep elevation, had reached the top, and the trainmen were making fast their brakes for the steep incline on the other side of the mountain, when my attention was drawn to a large number of people assembled in the valley below, some distance ahead. I then saw that the mountainside was covered with coal, and between 40 and 50 trucks lay in a heap at the foot of the mountain. This train had apparently, through some cause or another, jumped the rails, and the cars had rolled over and over from top to bottom. When I reached Cumberland, still being stared at and pointed out at various stations along the way, it was not long before an explanation was forthcoming. I, it seemed, had followed a train that had killed 44 men, 2 brakesmen, the engineer, conductor, and 40 tramps who were beating their way. On coming down the mountainside, the brakes had refused to work. The fireman had jumped off in time to save his own life, and the others had all been precipitated with the train into the valley and killed. It had run with such a reckless speed that it could not possibly maintain its hold of the rails, and this accounted for the one traveller on this train, and how horror-stricken the people had seemed at my temerity, which of course was no more than ignorance of the mishap. After this ride I never again felt comfortable on a train, much preferring to take my chance on the water, however stormy it might be. It gave me pause on that same night when an unknown man was struck down by a fast train, mangled and cut into pieces. 2 or 3 trains left this town of Cumberland before I could summon sufficient courage to ride. I was standing, still wondering when I should ride or walk from this town to Baltimore, when a switchman who had just helped finish making ready a train said, "Hello, lad, which way are you going? To Baltimore?" On answering in the affirmative, He said, pointing to this train, "Jump on and you'll be there early in the morning." Which I did, saying to myself at the same time, "This is my last train ride in America, whether I live or die." No sleep that night, and I was not sorry to reach Baltimore. And that's his final train journey in America. That's just a section of the book, and I wanted to talk about the travelling and the meeting of a tramp like Brum and the riding of freight trains. Things that I did when I was a teenager, when I was 18 years old, and on that trip, that summer holiday in the States. But it's an amazing book, The Autobiography of a Super-tramp by W.H. or William Henry Davies.